Hey everybody, we're live. So good evening from Minsk, Belarus, and welcome to the live show 138, the Oreshnik Cometh. It's 8 p.m. here, 6 p.m. in London, 1 p.m. in New York, 1 a.m. in Beijing, and 4 a.m. in Sydney. We're streaming live on Rumble, X, and YouTube, and tonight we're diving into the powder keg of global tension that could reshape the world as we know it. Ukraine's brazen attacks on Russia have pushed the bear to the brink. Strikes on Russia's nuclear strategic bombers, sabotage of railway bridges that left civilians dead and injured, and a shocking underwater assault on the Crimea Bridge. The questions are burning. Did the USA and UK know? Did they help? With US-made C4 found at the bridge and whispers of Western intelligence guiding these attacks, is Russia left with no choice to respond? And could that response unleash the devastating Oreshnik missiles on Ukraine or even Western targets? Join us tonight is our fearless analyst. And from Michael from Behanka Watch to unpack this escalating crisis. How are you, Michael?
Yeah, I'm okay. Just keeping busy. Quite busy in real life at the moment. So still trying to cast a weary eye on events in Eastern Europe. So hope you're keeping well.
I am. And before we start, how can people follow you, get hold of you, and of course pay you lots of money for your wonderful full analysis?
If people just sort of Google Michael Delabrock or Behanka Watch, that should hopefully reveal my Twitter and my Telegram. If not, my Telegram is t.me/mdelabroc, Delabrock on Telegram. And my Twitter account is pretty much the same, at Delabrock1 on X.
If not, so. Great. I was just saying earlier to you, it's 25C here today, nice and clear blue skies. And for those who are single or like window shopping, all the women are wearing their midriff tops and everything else. So I'm just tempting Michael again.
Yeah, he's desperate for me to come out, so he's going to psychologically torture me. So
Yes.
I'm going to do a little bit of a back. Did I just see you drink out of a Pepsi can?
Yes, Pepsi Max.
What's going on with that? You're a Coke man.
No, or a Pepsi Max man. I will drink Pepsi Max. Yeah, no sugar. They give this to chimpanzees, so it's not too bad apparently in zoos. Anyway, buckle up, share your thoughts in the chat, and let's get on with the truth together with the Oreshnik Cometh, and the world is watching. So let's do this. So tonight we confront a cascade of events that have pushed the Russian-Ukraine conflict into a perilous new threshold. Our purpose is clear: to lay the bare facts, examine the evidence, and explore the implications of Ukraine's recent actions against Russia. This is not about conjecture or bias. It's about understanding the stakes in the world inching closer to the unthinkable. So let's begin with the attacks. They've ignited this first. First, Ukraine has targeted Russia's strategic nuclear bombers, critical components of its nuclear triad. These are not ordinary aircraft, but Tupolev 295s, Tupolev 160s, and Tu-22Ms long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear payloads. Reports indicate drone strikes and missile attacks on air bases like Engels and, I can't say the other one, sorry, because I'm Western, deep inside Russian territory, damaging or destroying at least 2 aircraft and disrupting operations. The nuclear triad, Russia's land, sea, and air-based nuclear deterrent, is a cornerstone of its national security. An attack on this pillar is not just tactical, it's a direct challenge to Moscow's sovereignty. So, Michael, how significant are the Ukraine drone strikes on Engels and the other air bases, given they targeted Russia's nuclear-capable Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers?
So where to even begin on this? It was an extremely audacious attack, very ingenious and original in its conduct, planning, and execution. However, I think there's a lot of nuance, my favorite word, about the actual outcome of it. So for people who, as Dave's kind of outlined, the main target appears to have been the Tu-95 Bears, which are the Russian equivalent of the B-52. These are extremely old aircraft. I believe they first entered service in the 1950s and 60s. some of these aircraft are far older than the pilots who are piloting them. But I don't view this necessarily. Of course, it is an aspect to it that this was a direct attack on Russia's nuclear triad. I view it more as Ukrainians, one, as a gesture, as kind of a threat, but also the diplomatic aspects in regards to the ongoing talks in Istanbul. I think the very specific targets of these aircraft were down to the fact that the Tu-95s, especially, not so much the Tu-160s or even the Tu-22s, is that is the Tu-95 bears that are the missile tugs that are used by the Russians to conduct their cruise missile strikes with things like the X-101, the 2-degree calibers, the KH-101s, the sort of air-deployed cruise missiles. It's usually the Tu-95s that are the platform from which the Russians deploy these missiles at targets in Ukraine. They have done pretty much since the first days of the war. So I think that's kind of why the Ukrainians were especially keen to make a point, a big show about targeting these aircraft, but also the fact that they did it just so deep inside Russia as well. There's been some attacks on the Bant Olenia, the Russian air base, where these aircraft are usually normally stored in large numbers up in Murmansk Oblast, which is about 2,000 miles away from Ukraine itself. The Ukrainians have done some operations up there with mixed success, but the fact that they had Belenia, this airbase way out in the Russian Far East, out by in deepest Siberia, is kind of a demonstration that nowhere inside Russia is effectively safe to a degree from Ukrainian operations against air bases. So I think that's kind of the aspect of what the Ukrainians were going for. One that's very high profile, humiliating attack on Russia and its air bases, but also coaxing it with the idea of, instead of just hitting random air bases and random aircraft, very specifically going after the aircraft that are very active against their operations against Ukraine. Like, if the Ukrainians really wanted to, like, this is going to be a very expensive, running into the billions of dollars in damages for the Russians. In particular, one specific aircraft, which I'll come to. But in terms of if the Ukrainians were really after to hit the Russians, like, financially, I would have suggested that they could have probably have targeted like their strategic lift aircraft, their heavy lift, the things like the IL-76s, the Ruslans, things like that. Those are the more modern, extremely expensive, very hard to replace aircraft that come with very big price tags. The Tu-95s, they're not built anymore. The production line shut down, I think, in the late 80s, potentially even the 90s. These aircraft are maintained via constant modernization. So it's not like the Russians are, very expensive, hard to, can't really be replaced. They can, because to a degree, with a modern aircraft, which we'll come to in a second. But in terms of, it's not like, there's now a price tag has just popped up at the aviation ministry in Moscow saying, okay, we need to replace the Tu-95s. You can't. They're not going to start production. You can't start production. This is a Soviet legacy that has been diminished by this attack. What the Russians could potentially do, where there's some very interesting questions to be asked, is the Russians did restart production on the Tu-160s, which is the far more modern, somewhat dated by this stage because they came out in the 80s, but again, subject to heavy modernization. But the Russians restarted production of the Tu-160s in recent years. So in a roundabout way, maybe in a decade and a half of production, because I believe that it's about one Tu-60 is produced every year and a half or something like that. So if the Russians expanded production of that aircraft, in time they could modernize their airborne nuclear triad to a degree, and also replace the losses. But another aspect is that there were Tu-160s on these bases, on some of them, and it appears that There's speculation that one of them might have been hit by one of these drones, but generally it appears that the Tu-160s on the bases, which were in full display, evident by satellite footage that came out the day after, which showed the location of some of them. These aircraft were largely left out of the Ukrainian strikes. For whatever reason, the Ukrainians decided not to largely focus on the Tu-160s that were on the base. It was very much about the Tu-95s, but also in some other aircraft, some smaller strategic lift aircraft, the AN-12s, a couple of IL-76s apparently, but very particularly the A-50 Berev, which is perhaps the most expensive and perhaps the most rare aircraft that the Russian Air Force actually fields. This is, I think it runs into something like $1-2 billion per aircraft. This is a Russian airborne command and control AWACS aircraft. And there's Ukrainian drone footage of a drone actually hitting the aerial radar of one of these aircraft.
Yeah, there's the photo there of one of them.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at footage at the moment, a compilation of the drone aircraft, and it looks like there's two of these beside each other. And then obviously the drone strikes one of them. Another one of these aircraft, I believe, was accidentally shot down by Russian air defense over Rostov last year sometime. And Ukrainian / quote unquote Belarusian partisans actually conducted another alleged drone attack on one of these aircraft whenever they were stationed at an airbase in Belarus in 2023. Not 2023. But it doesn't seem that there was any actually damage to the aircraft itself. So this is an aircraft that Ukrainians and Ukrainian-aligned factions appear to have a particular interest in, again, because of the capability it provides, but also the sheer expense that it is to the Russian state. So, but in terms, I just find it very interesting. Again, the Tu-160s, they are used occasionally, very more rarely, to conduct missile strikes on targets in Ukraine. But if the Ukrainians were after this idea that they're going to destroy the Russian nuclear triad, very much so it would have been the Tu-160s that I would have expected the Ukrainians to go after. So that the fact that they didn't seem to particularly focus on that aircraft, I think shows a level of restraint on the Ukrainian side. I think they understand that it's one thing to take out the Tu-160s for the reasons I've said. There's a certain level of justification for it. It's an old aircraft. The strikes that they tend to conduct, firing the X-101s into Ukraine, from what I've been able to gather over the years, they come with very mixed results. Lots of them get shot down. Lots of them don't make it the target. There's malfunctions with them. So it's not as if the Ukrainians have taken out a crucial asset that's essential to the war effort. It seems to be a very specific. They were moderated in the damage that they could have done, is what I would have said. If I was the guy running this operation, I would have imagined in my head the Tu-160s would have been top of the list, the A-50 Berevs, and then you work your way down in like the potency and also the cost of the aircraft that you could have hit. So I do think there was probably a level of restraint that the Ukrainian operation conducted itself by going after the specific bombers and aircraft that they seem to have largely focused on. So that, plus also I think it's just generally about sending the message to the Russians that you need to be serious about these talks that we're having, or else there'll be more events like this will happen in the future. Because you can imagine no airbase in Russia at the moment must be feeling particularly safe after this event. And we'll probably come on to this later on in the show, but it also appears that Ukrainian special operations operates on an extremely advanced tier that eclipses pretty much anything I've seen from the Russians at this stage of the war. So I would imagine that there are probably God knows how many Ukrainian teams and assets currently deep inside Russia, building up their credibility, building up their capabilities, waiting for the signal for future operations. So it's not the case that this attack has happened, therefore there'll be nothing that will happen again in the future. I think this is kind of a demonstration that there is extremely entrenched, extremely deep and capable Ukrainian special operators currently inside Russia, planning who's not knows what for the future. So I think a large part of this Operation Spider's Web, as it's being termed by the Ukrainians, I think a large part of it was sending that message to Moscow, saying that the longer this goes on for, yeah, the war at the front is a completely different conflict with different ramifications than the war that we're waging. But this shadow war that we're waging against Moscow, it can go on longer and it can get more painful. So, there's very strong implications that the Ukrainians were heavily involved in the overthrow of the Assad government, one of Russia's very few, very close diplomatic allies. There's indications that not indications, there is proof that Ukrainian special forces have been operating in the Sudan, in Mali specifically, aligning themselves with various local factions to fight particularly Wagner men and frustrate Russian and Wagner operations in those countries. You've had the various, from high profile to less well-known, assassinations of Russian military figures, of people like Daria Dugin, which obviously Dugin himself, it was his daughter who was killed, but he was obviously the target. You've had commanders of Russian bomber divisions. You've had Ukrainian defectors, former Ukrainian politicians who have been assassinated inside Russia, but also in Spain in recent months. I'm sure, as we'll come to later in this show, we've had the recent railway bombings in Bryansk and Kursk Oblast. You've had the attack on the Kerch Bridge. So it appears that Ukraine is, and they've been doing it for years, is that the Ukrainians have been waging it depends how you quantify successful, because in terms of the actual direction of the war at the front, doesn't really seem to be changing the dial too much on that end. But in terms of the pain that it's doing to Moscow, making this, making the political establishment, the military establishment back in Russia feel the sting of their conflict in Ukraine, I think it's fairly successful in that aspect. So that's kind of my preliminary thoughts on this so far. But I'm also, as many other people were, my original idea of whenever the news first came out, because I know that Ukrainians have been toying with this idea, is that this attack was conducted by an airborne drone carrier. That is, that there is a larger mothership type aircraft, a drone that carries smaller drones, which deploys them in a piecemeal fashion. That is what I initially thought this attack was, because I know the Ukrainians have been experimenting with that for a number of years now, which is terrifying in its own aspect. But the idea that it was concealed in essentially truck containers, these drones were deployed from truck containers that were, again, one aspect of it is extremely terrifying, because I can immediately imagine that, well, what's to stop Muslim extremists from doing the same thing and getting one of these truck containers, paying some unwitting truck driver, because truck drivers around the world, they aren't really told what their cargo is. They're just told, right, this is the pickup, this is the drop off, and that seems to have been what happened to most of the Russian truck drivers here, is that was the orders they were given. So I'm just of the mindset, well, what's to stop like Muslim extremists from doing this exact thing, getting one of these truck containers, or a few of them, and just parking them in the center or near the center of a major Western city, and just repeating this. So the ingenious, what would be the right term? Ingenuity of the attack was shocking and astounding, but also extremely disturbing in its ramifications, because now obviously, kind of like the Israeli pager attacks, once it's happened, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle. There's lots of people scared shitless by what happened, but you can imagine there will be other actors, geopolitical non-state actors, more malicious actors, who will be looking at it and thinking, well, why can't we do that? And I can imagine there will be a lot of people staring at this, wondering, well, why can't we do this? Say against an American airbase, a NATO airbase, a Chinese airbase, whatever airbase. Like, how do you defend an airbase against these kind of things? You'd have to have constant patrols around the perimeter with guys with shotguns, which just really isn't feasible. You can't have a guard 24/7 motivated enough to keep them motivated enough to do a boring job, just on the off chance that for 5 minutes a whole bunch of drones might just come across the perimeter and start hitting aircraft on the tarmac.
Yeah,
So
but some of the attacks did fail because of electronic warfare that was on some of the airfields. If you have a
yeah,
look,
that was quick thinking on some of the commanders on the base. But I mean, I've seen footage of just like Russian, probably conscripts on anti-aircraft guns just sitting on the tarmac, just watching these things just fly into the aircraft, and they're just like, well, what are we meant to do? Do we fire the 23 millimeter cannons across the airbase, across the tarmac, and hit the buildings on the other side of the airbase, or hit any aircraft stationed on the other side of the tarmac? And but the thing is like you'd have to have your the word goes out within minutes that there's drones coming onto the base, and then how the electronic warfare guys, like within like 2 minutes or so, given the speed some of these drones are moving at, would have to be extremely quick on the mark to start doing what they're doing. The point is like every cog needs to be working extremely well and efficiently for you to properly negate an attack like this. And unfortunately, it's, you can't have, a lot of these cogs are troops, soldiers, humans, and humans get bored or they're not trained well enough. Especially for the Russians, who have certain long running issues with the quality of some of their troops, and especially concerning any trained soldiers, you're going to want them at the front in Ukraine. So they leave air-based defense largely to conscripts. Like I say, some 19-year-old kid who isn't paid well, who's just trying to slog through his national service, and then you have this happens to him, I would suggest don't expect great things. So this opens up a whole can of worms about future air-based defense, not just for Russia, but across the world.
because also, as you know, these aircraft were in the open because of the strategic treaties so America could count them from satellites, and that's why the B-52s are out in the open as well.
Yeah. And there's also the thing is, I've seen a lot of people saying, well, why don't you build hangars for them? Well, it's like, it's just not going to be feasible to build hundreds of hangars.
Well, they're not allowed to due to
Yeah.
the
Treaty limitations, but also,
yeah.
can you imagine like the size of these aircraft, the size of the hangars?
What about nets?
You could potentially put nets up. I know some air bases have done that as well, but I mean, I'm staring at some of the footage of these drones. Like, these are not just unmanned drones. These were FPV drones. These are the kind of stuff that we've unfortunately become very aware of the footage of in Ukraine, where there's a guy on the other end who's directing this thing with pinpoint precision to hit a physical person in Ukraine. It's these kind of drones that were used in these attacks. So even if you did put a net on it, I mean, unless you're going to drape the entire aircraft in a net, but then you're probably going to spend about 30 minutes each time, if that, trying to uncloak the aircraft from the net or lift up the front to allow the aircraft to go out and fly about. And again, these are sortie aircraft. These are aircraft that are often used in strikes. So it's probably just not going to be feasible to keep them under net 24/7.
Why can't you keep the electronic warfare going all the time?
Because I would imagine it'd probably play havoc with your own electronics, your own comms and stuff.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine military grade electronics is going to be extremely, I've seen some videos of Russian troops who have them strapped to the back of on their backs. And I'm like, that guy's probably going to get brain cancer in a couple of years because of this stuff. Military electronics is extremely powerful. If you're blasting this stuff out 24/7 across an airbase, well, one, that you're probably going to give all the personnel on the airbase cancer if they're long enough, but it's going to play havoc with your comms. And again, a lot of these air bases are, as we've seen, they're right next to civilian roads, or there'll be a town populated by base personnel, but also generally civilians as well next to the airbase. Depending how the arc of the electronic warfare. Now, I'm not an expert in electronics in the warfare, but I can imagine, if you're blasting electronic warfare 24/7 across the town, well, Babushka is not going to be able to watch TV, or none of the phones are going to work. It's just not a feasible prospect.
Yeah, because these drones were supposed to run on the Russian cell phone system, right?
Yeah, I believe so as well. So maybe that was one aspect. If the second you hear alerts attack, you just shut off the local internet. Maybe that's it. But then you'd have to have the system set up to do that, and it'd have to work efficiently. But it's just so many. I'm sure there's tech geniuses and stuff, maybe like yourself, Dave, who knows the technology a lot well, who could work out efficient solutions to this stuff. But this is something new. This is something that there's been small scale versions of this, like a drone flown onto an airbase and something like that. But the scale of it is on just such a another level that the questions that arise from it, and the solutions to it are just. It's kind of like the first use of the nuclear bomb. This is something that's pretty much completely new. It's like, well, how do you deal with this? Is you have to build up an entire infrastructure, an entire strategy, entire tactics of just how to mitigate and protect against this stuff. And again, this is not just Russia. I'm pretty sure pretty much every military power worth its name has been paying close attention to what's happened over Ukraine. In Ukraine for years now, and this is just going to be another headache for him, where it's like, well, thank God this didn't happen to us first, but how do we stop this from happening to us?
Yeah. How much damage do you estimate these strikes cause Russia's nuclear triad, and could they impair its deterrence capability?
From my understanding, there's estimates around about 14% of the fleet, which is no small number whenever it comes to strategic bombers, because I can imagine if you just imagine if the United States lost 14% of its B-52s, its B-2 bombers, its B-1 the B-1 bombers, that would be, I couldn't even imagine what the reaction in the United States towards something like that would be. That I would expect that's probably whenever the United States, if they identified immediately who it was and it was another state, that would be like probably, okay, well, should we seriously start firing nukes at them because of why they're attacking our nuclear bombers?
Yeah.
But
we'll get onto that about Russia's responses anyway afterwards.
In terms of the actual physical damage to it, I don't think the Russian nuclear triad is necessarily especially undermined, because the bombers aren't the major part of the triad. It's the Russian submarines, and particularly the Russian land-based missiles, of which they have thousands. So I don't think Moscow is of the mindset that shit, someone's going after our nuclear deterrent. We better fire our nukes first, because obviously they're going to fire ours at theirs. I don't think it's that situation, because the airborne aspect of the triad, in terms of the total nuclear warhead capacity that Russia has, is going to be a fairly small portion of it compared to the other two aspects of it. So I don't think the nuclear triad is necessarily impacted that much. Where I do think that there is a potential for some serious concern is the fact that, if you remember last year, particularly, the Ukrainians got it into their head that it was a particularly good idea to start firing drones at Russian long-range, not just long-range radar, but specifically their anti-ballistic missile radars.
Yeah.
And then it got so bad that the Biden administration had to publicly rebuke the Ukrainians and tell them to stop doing that. So that is where I would be, if this is part of a wider aspect that the Ukrainians think is a good idea. That's where I would be concerned, because if I was the United States, if I was a major power in NATO, that's the kind of the bombers, because the bombers are actively used to hit targets in Ukraine, is one thing, but firing missiles at their anti-ballistic missile radars is probably one of the worst things I would imagine you could do during this war, because the Russians, being enmeshed in a ground war is bad enough. But then you've got these geopolitical tensions with the United States, with NATO powers. The worst thing I can imagine you'd want to do, especially whenever people are throwing around the nuclear threats a lot, is to start poking the Russians in their eyes so they can't see any potential missiles launched. I would imagine it would be in the best interests of Western powers, which is probably why the Biden administration rebuked the Ukrainians for doing it at the time. Is to say, no, we want the Russians to have their eyes open. They need to have as much confidence as they can have that we aren't going to start lobbing nuclear missiles at them. Because if they go blind through Ukrainian attacks, what's to say that Moscow isn't going to be of the mindset, well, this is Western powers using the Ukrainians to undermine our ability to see a potential nuclear attack, which, is not a good idea for anyone. So this is probably something we'll probably never know. Maybe we'll find out in 50 years whenever documents are declassified, or in 10 years whenever the people involved in the operation decide to start going on documentaries and saying their mentality and stuff behind it. But that would be my concern. Is this a one-off strike? Is this something that was cooked up, totally original, independent operation, or is this part of a wider aspect that the Ukrainians have gotten into their head that, yeah, we're going to start going after the Russian nuclear component in various ways? So that would be my thoughts on that aspect of it. In terms of a dollar price, again, a lot of these aircraft, they're not in production, so you're not exactly getting, what does a bomber that was built in maybe the 1970s that's been modernized maybe 10 times since then, how do you put a dollar value on that whenever it's not being produced anymore? But I'd imagine you're probably talking, because there's different estimates about the number of aircraft that were destroyed, ones that were damaged, ones that are potentially damaged or destroyed, but you can't tell because of the satellite images. And then there's also the claims that the Ukrainians have made of up to 40 aircraft. But even going by the lowest possible estimate, where you can physically see the destroyed aircraft on the tarmac by satellite, I'd imagine you're probably talking into the billions of dollars in damage. And then on top of that, you've also got the aspect that the Russian intelligence and security state is now going to have to completely revamp itself, put in new measures, which is going to run into God knows how many billions of rubles as well. So extremely expensive in a dollar ruble terms for Russia and Moscow, with the caveat that it could probably have been a lot more expensive if the Ukrainians, again, were they showing restraint? Was there some other reason? Did they just not know the bombers, the Tu-160s were there? Well, they obviously did, because they hit one of them. We don't know the thinking or the logic behind it, but it could have been a lot more expensive. But the other aspect is that from what I can see, is only one person was actually killed that we are aware of in this attack, and it appears to have been a Russian trucker who was strangled to death. The story, who knows what the story is behind that? Did he clock on that maybe there was something going on? But then this says who strangled him was their Ukrainian handlers with the drivers at the time. Were the drivers in on it? So who knows what the story is behind that? But it appears that in terms of the airbase strikes themselves, that there was only one death, and it was this potential driver who was killed via strangulation via zip ties. But then the other aspect is this wasn't just an isolated event. Is the night before, the Ukrainians hit the bridges in Kursk and Bryansk Oblast, which had a far larger toll on civilians. There was more people killed in those incidents. Then you've also, days after, you have these ongoing strikes on the Kerch Bridge as well. So it does appear, and I don't think that it's over by any stretch, it does appear that there is an ongoing, pretty extensive campaign of Ukrainian irregular operations against Russia that I don't think is over yet. But so that's kind of my aspects of it. I think the airbase strikes were the big, look, we're doing this, pay attention, eye-grabbing thing. But the strikes in the Bryansk Oblast and Kursk on the bridges, the Kerch Bridge, and then I would imagine we're probably going to see some other things over the coming days, as it does appear that Ukraine is waging a full-scale and painful. I'm choosing not to say effective, because again, I don't think this is going to change much of the needle of the war at the front, but it is extremely expensive and costly to Russia in other aspects, as this irregular war that's being waged on Russia, often inside of Russia itself.
Mm-hmm. Could the airfield attacks push Russia to rethink its reliance on centralized air bases for strategic assets? Or or because of the treaties with the SALT II treaty and all that, they sort of have to have everything in one on these air bases out in the open?
I'm not a person to speak to about the specific provisions of the SALT treaties. I just don't think it's very feasible. And even if it was more feasible, I don't think it would be particularly advantageous because if you disperse these bombers out, say you send like 5 bombers or even 2 bombers to various air bases, then you have to bring in the infrastructure on the air bases to support the bombers. And then the logistics trains to maintain that would just become so unwieldy because what are you going to do? Are you going to like split up each and every air base in Russia will have 2 bombers, 2 different types of fighters, 2 different types of strike fight. Do you know what I mean? Is the logistics trains would just become so unwieldy. And then on top of that, basing the personnel as well. But ultimately, it'd probably just be futile because as these attacks showed is they could just strike various air bases. They seem to have gotten lucky because a couple of these drone containers seem to have detonated prematurely in transit to their targets. But don't rely on faulty equipment or potential incompetence for future security. Even if you did disperse these aircraft across various air bases, what's to say that the Ukrainians just don't do this attack again on a larger basis? I think the ultimate thing is you just have to figure out how to upgrade base security against this stuff and invest heavily into it. I don't see how dispersal, unless you're going to disperse them to some new air bases, which you're going to build or reactivate in the high Arctic, far away from any roads. But then how do you get transport logistics to that? You're going to fly everything in. If you're going to do this, if you're going to disperse them, you'd have to disperse them. The air bases not near civilian population centers, not near civilian accessible roads. I would imagine at that stage you're just getting into so unwieldy, so unmanageable, and just so prohibitively expensive to do that. It would just be unfeasible. I would just say that probably the best solution would be just invest in new ways and existing systems of how to stop an attack like this while it's in progress. My immediate thought would be some form of AI, artificial intelligence, that you put a local AI onto the base security system where it picks up, okay, there's drones coming onto base. I'm immediately going to, the AI then automatically activates either kinetic elements, something to shoot down the drones physically, or else then it activates electronic warfare countermeasures, something like that. Because I think ultimately in an attack like this, where the actual time span of the attack appears to have been about 10-15 minutes, while these things were coming onto the base and physically hitting targets. 10-15 minutes. I mean, you have a bit of military experience yourself, Dave. Like, can you imagine in a panic? Yeah, time slows down, but especially on the size of an airbase, in 10-15 minutes, how do you figure out where the attack is coming? What is the attack? Are you being hit by artillery shells? Unless someone physically sees the drone who then tries to report it up in command. But, it's going to be a chaotic situation. So I would imagine the solution to this would be...
There's $1 million business, AI defense.
Yeah, I would imagine that'd probably be the best solution to something like this, is actually trying to remove the human element out of this. So it's all automatic, all run by. But then again, you get into the problem. Do we really want to start seconding national security out to computers and stuff? But in terms of like this, I would imagine probably the best solution would be some kind of localized AI security measure, which just once it happens, the AI just immediately springs into action. Whereas, physical human personnel on the base, you have the initial panic and confusion. How many minutes are lost to that? How many aircraft and assets are lost to that before people actually figure out what's going on and how to properly respond to it?
How do you see Russian civilians reacting to the Ukraine strikes so deep inside their territory? Anger, fear, or resolve?
This has kind of been the $1 million question. Is obviously, I think there'll be an element of anger and humiliation that, but then again, it hasn't happened this so far deep into Russia, but the Ukrainians have been hitting targets around Moscow for pretty much since the first year of the war. So to a degree, I think there's sort of an element of like acceptance that, yeah, look, we're at war, this is going to happen kind of thing. But if I'm going to be honest, the Russians I speak to, I tend not to speak about the war for obvious reasons. So I wouldn't really even have an anecdotal response to it. And I think that's kind of like the $1 million question is finding out what Russians actually do think about this stuff. I do believe that Russians are broadly supportive of it, of the war itself, and that this is a war, the country is at war, we have to kind of accept this stuff and plug along for the national good. But in terms of this sort of constant drip that, okay, yeah, the country is at war, but also we're kind of constantly being reminded that the state is failing, and spectacularly failing at intercepting and protecting the homeland during this war from what is nominally a vastly inferior opponent. I do wonder what that might be doing in Russian psyches. But again, I'm afraid that psychoanalyzing the Russian population is probably a bit beyond me. And whenever I speak to Russians, it just tends to be, do you know what I mean? The ones who I'm friendly with or friends with, I don't want to be that guy who just talks about the one subject and stuff. Like I'll ask them if there's something happened in their region, but I don't tend to ask them stuff that could potentially get them into trouble. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Is there a risk that this Ukraine success emboldens other adversaries to test Russia's defenses?
In that regards, I would suggest Syria would be a major concern. That airbase at Himin has come under pretty amateur and low-level drone attacks ever since the collapse of the Assad government. And it does appear that particularly Chechen and Uzbek militants in Syria aren't fully on board with the new government's idea that let's try and find an accommodation with the Russians, because of course a lot of these Chechens and Tajiks and Uzbeks, they've come to Syria with the idea of either fighting Russians physically or at least getting the knowledge of how to effectively fight the Russians whenever they go home, for lack of a better term. So I would suggest that if there is a place of I think the only people who are going to be doing something like this inside Russia itself will be the Ukrainians. I can't see like a bunch of Dagestani militants pulling off something along this lines. But where you could have something of the scale, I would suggest it would be Himin Air Base, where you could have some more advantageous state actors, maybe someone within the Syrian government. I don't know why Russia always seems to go back and trust them for some reason, but I could definitely see the Turks decide this might be a pretty good idea to get the Russians out of Syria. Maybe some other countries that might have untoward views towards the Russians might decide this might be a good idea to test in Syria. But then again, with the caveat that the only thing that really seems to go through Himin Air Base, from my understanding, any permanent aircraft, is like a couple of helicopters, which they use to just do security on the base whenever there's an attack or something. And generally, it tends to be strategic lift aircraft, the IA-76s, that come in to resupply the base or send or on transit to targets in Africa predominantly. So I'm not too sure of what assets on the base in terms of aircraft, unless they time it right, they could really hit. But in terms of like just, radars, other smaller military assets, maybe Russian personnel on the base, maybe that's something they could go for. But in terms of inside Russia itself, I would imagine it would probably just be the Ukrainians who would be pulling off that.
What's the likelihood Russia uses these attacks to justify major escalation, given the nuclear triad's symbolic weight?
This is kind of the problem I think the Russians are in. What can they do to escalate? What can they do that they haven't done before? Well, the only real option there is like, what are they going to do? Nuke Kiev? which I don't think is particularly viable or necessarily advantageous for Moscow. I mean, they fired pretty much every cruise missile they can at Ukraine. I would. I see. This is a problem I think the Russians have kind of put themselves in with this conflict. Is the Ukrainians can escalate and escalate and escalate, but the problem for the Russians is their only retaliation towards that escalation is a larger drone strike, a larger missile strike. You know, Russia doesn't really have from my perception, is Russia doesn't really have. They're kind of boxed in because obviously one of the big aspects that they could escalate is they could start hitting bases in Poland that supply Ukraine. But
is that why the Americans moved everything out of their base near the border?
Potentially, I think
A few days beforehand.
I think that's probably just the Trump administration is just tired of Ukraine and it's looking to just get out of the show. And also part of the wider pivot from
there was a report that Hesketh was watching this live.
Who? Oh, Hesketh?
Yeah, was watching it live.
What, the Ukrainian attack?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine they were, because they were informed just a few minutes before. So I can imagine that probably most Western defense officials were probably watching this. Once they were informed of it, were probably given live feeds of it.
Oh, do you think the West wasn't involved at all?
In supplying equipment, yes, but in terms of the actual conduct of the strikes itself, I'd be extremely skeptical on that end of it. Again, because I don't think it's in the interest of Western states to start fucking with the Russian nuclear triad, but also particularly the Americans are looking to kind of de-escalate this stuff. Yeah,
some Trump Americans.
Some of them.
Lindsey Graham and all the senators want to.
The administration. The Trump administration is who I'm predominantly referring to. I think.
But don't you think the administration is now not fighting, but has disagreements with the intelligence and the others in the Senate and all that?
In the Senate, but
they want to keep it going, whereas the administration wants to stop it.
I would be, especially concerning that most of the new directors have been put into office, I would be extremely surprised, but also concerned if like the CIA or someone like that has decided we're going to start conducting strikes against Russian strategic aviation. That would be counterproductive, but also extremely disturbing. And I would imagine we probably would have heard something about it by now. Trump either would have exploded on Twitter or something. Like, yeah, Trump might be moving
he's been
back.
Very quiet.
Yeah, I think he's moving back towards Ukraine because the Russians are stonewalling the negotiations. But I don't think Trump ultimately at his heart is of the mindset that, you know, we need to cripple Russia and start really fucking with the nuclear football. Because I think because this is what Trump has always been about in regards to Russia, is de-escalation and trying to bring them on side. So I do. This is the other aspect I have, particularly in my channel, is there's a lot of people who seem to be of the mindset that Ukraine effectively are like they're impotent. They can't do anything. Everything is done for them. Anything that Ukraine normally does do is actually NATO or the West that does it, and Ukraine just takes the fall for it. Again, I think it's been pretty much amply demonstrated. Yeah, I'm sure there are advisors, probably not in this one because of the potential political ramifications of this specific attack, but I'm sure that there is NATO advisors from various countries that are suggesting things and stuff like this, and definitely supplying equipment. But ultimately, I think probably the majority of the planning and stuff for this strike and the conduct of it, I would believe it would be a complete Ukrainian operation apart from the equipment that were supplied. Because I don't see, because in terms of like the equipment and the technicals of the strike itself, apart from the drones, it's actually kind of, whenever you think about it, it's actually kind of fairly simple on a technical aspect of what they've done here. What is it? You get a couple of truck containers, you refab them so they still look like truck containers, but you have a hidden compartment on the top. You put in a self-destructing munition inside of it, and then you put the drones on the top. Like that, whenever you think about it, that's actually not this is why I'm concerned that terrorists will start doing this, because the technical feasibility of this isn't actually that extremely far advanced. Where it does start to get technical is hooking up the drones to the internet to be controlled from Ukraine. But in terms of like the physical rent out a warehouse, send out the trucks kind of stuff, it's not, to do that, I would imagine you'd probably have to have Ukrainians who've probably lived in Russia, who understand how the FSB work, how Russian local law enforcement work, how Russian air-based security works. And I would imagine that's probably all going to have come from majority Ukrainians who have lived in Russia. Probably some of them were actually in the Russian Air Force in the 90s. People who speak fluent Russian, people who understand what Russia is like, what it's like to live there, what it's like to operate there. So I'm kind of a bit skeptical on what exactly NATO partners, quote unquote, could have provided to this. So I know that people have certain ideas about where I stand in this conflict and my views and stuff on it, but I'm of the mindset you would have to provide me proof, substantial proof, to convince me that that Western nations had an active part in the planning and conduct of this.
Yeah, but as you saw with the New York Times article a few months ago, or whatever it was, the US and all these have been actively planning on this war all along. So why wouldn't they be involved in this?
Again, because I don't think it's in the United States or any country's interest to start poking the Russian nuclear triad in the eye.
Rick Young in the chat says US deep state is putting up a desperate effort to regain power. Noticed how it happened after the Saudi trip. What do you think of that?
I'm not an expert on how it works, but I would imagine that they aren't able to get away with much with I forget who's the CIA director again.
Don't know.
I forget it, but
no, Tulsi's above him.
She, if Tulsi is, and Tulsi is very against this kind of stuff. If Tulsi's in office, if I forget his name, the Indian guy in the FBI, if he's in office, the fact
Kash Patel,
I can't pronounce his name. The secretary,
Bongino,
Hegseth,
Bongino in FBI.
Yeah, if these guys are still there, I don't think you could pull off something like this on the black books without them getting some kind of wind and stepping into it. Because ultimately, again, I think the American administration's idea towards this is de-escalation and trying to get out of it, not to escalate it. So that's kind of where I'm tending towards in terms of my thoughts on this, in terms of the wider geopolitics.
Okay. Next.
Plus, also there's the aspect that these bases are extremely close to China. And I can imagine probably not a good idea to do something that the Chinese are going to look at and think that, well, if they're doing this on the Russian side of the border, and this is an American-run or NATO operation, probably not something you'd want to start dabbling around with. Oh, pardon me.
Okay, next we turn to sabotage of the railway bridges. Over the past months, multiple incidents have targeted Russia's rail infrastructure, vital for both civilian and military logistics. One prominent attack in the Samara Oblast saw a bridge collapse after the explosion, derailing a freight train and killing at least 5 civilians with dozens injured. Russian authorities claim improvised explosive devices were used, and they found one with American C4 military-grade explosive were found at the site. These bridges are lifelines connecting Russia's vast regions and supporting supply chains. Their destruction disrupts not only military movements but the lives of ordinary citizens. So, Michael, the Samara Oblast bridge sabotage killed civilians with C4. How does this fit into Ukraine's broader strategy against Russia's logistics?
I'm not too familiar with the Samara attack. The ones I'm more familiar with are the ones in Bryansk and Kursk last week. But again, a bridge is a bridge. It's a vital bit of I do believe that bridges are like, and this is on the Ukrainian side, whenever the Russians like bomb bridges over the Dnieper or whatever, and then you have people complaining, particularly Western politicians, saying, well, this is a war crime. And it's like, well, is it? Because I mean, in every single war, Iraqi freedom and stuff like this, bridges are legitimate military targets because, as you say, they're essential to logistics. I think the aspect and consideration that should be taken is trying to destroy them while there isn't civilians on them. And then if you're going to start bombing bridges like this, unless you're of the mindset where you're just like, well, we just want to start killing Russian civilians in train cars that go over the bridge, trying to give some kind of appropriate warning to allow you to leave the area, but also let the local authorities know, like, yeah, we've blown up your bridge, so don't send a civilian train full of civilians over the bridge kind of thing.
One of them seemed to be timed where it exploded to fall on the train as it was going through.
Yeah, that's I believe that was what happened was it Bryansk? It blew up just before the bridge went across it. That to me is, if that is what is happening, then that is, to me, that's where it moves from like a legitimate target to moving into, okay, this is basically terrorism now.
Why? Yeah, keep going.
What is served, unless you're waging a terrorist campaign, which I don't think Ukraine really should or is of the mind to do, where it's just let's start killing Russian civilians for the sake of killing Russian civilians. You don't want to start popping bridges while there's trains going over it. You want to hit them while the train is passed. So, you destroy the asset and you disrupt Russian logistics, but, you're not just killing a whole bunch of people for the sake of killing them.
Why are Russia's railways so vulnerable to sabotage despite their critical role in military and civilian life?
It's just the size of the country.
Okay.
I mean,
The FSB claims C4 points to Western involvement. Do you buy that?
Again, going back to my previous question, do I think MI5 or the NSA or the CIA or something like that is of the mindset let's just start blowing up
Well, you can't see the UK doing that?
Not particularly, no. And even given my dim state of British state, I can't see the British security services deciding, right, we're going to start blowing up Russian trains. Again, I do believe that they're supplying the equipment, but then again, you supply thousands of rifles to Ukraine. Some of them end up in some special operations unit that goes into Russia, like happened last year with those American volunteers who got killed in, was it Bryansk Oblast, trying to cross the border. Once you give this stuff to Ukraine, unless you have a control over it, it's going to end up in there somewhere. So supplying the equipment, yeah. In terms of, again, do I believe that like American, British, German personnel are sitting in Ukraine deciding, right, we're going to blow up this bridge while there's a train going across it? I'd be a little bit skeptical on that.
How severe is the disruption from these bridge attacks on Russia's supply lines to the front?
Not. I would imagine not very much, especially in Bryansk and Kursk Oblast. From my understanding, one of the bridges is already up and running. The other one where the train actually came down, of course, you need to take time to clear that. But, there's so many railroads running across. And I'm not even sure if these railroads in Bryansk and Kursk were actually essential or very important to military logistics. Because from my understanding, apart from that train line that runs through Zaporizhia and Donetsk into Rostov, because of the nature of where it is, I'm pretty sure that most Russian military logistics have actually moved away from rail lines within 500 miles of the Ukrainian border. I think most of it's bussed in by truck and stuff. It's all road logistics now. So again, that's my understanding of it from what I've read over the years. I'm sure they probably still use trains to bring in like heavy equipment and stuff, maybe in the Rostov and some basin areas next to the border. But I imagine most of this Russian military logistics for stuff below tanks and heavy vehicles and large missiles are probably just being trucked in at this stage.
Should Russia overhaul its rail security with drones or AI surveillance?
Or
is the rail system just too big to do that?
I would err towards the side it's probably just too big. So like, what would be the gambit here, that you have drones constantly going along the rail line, and there's like what 50,000 kilometers of rail line across Russia, if
Mm-hmm.
not more. From my understanding, is there's, because railways in Russia are all electrified. They all have, those electric pylons on top of the rails that put power down it to power the trains. From
Mm-hmm.
my understanding, is when there's a break in the line, is that then sends a signal to the local signal box or the train. Again, I'm not au fait with rail infrastructure, but from my understanding, that's how you figure out if there's like a break in the line and where it is. Because once one of these pylons go down, well, you look at where the transmission has cut out and where it restarts again, so that you can sort of narrow down where it is. So if the bridge goes down, obviously the electric pylons that power the train go down with them, so you could tell where that happens. But again, I don't know the technology in terms of drones and AI to see how maybe you could put AI into the electric monitoring system to maybe more accurately pin it down. But ultimately, like, a rail line's a rail line unless you put a big fence the entire span of it. How I don't, this is why throughout history, from World War II, Vietnam, all this stuff, while railways are always like the favored target of partisans and stuff, because they're, how are you going to secure a rail line 100 miles outside the local village or the city center, where you can just go up and put a bit of C4 on it, or a bridge or something like that?
Mm-hmm. How do civilian deaths in Samara change the political pressure on Putin to respond forcefully?
I do. There will be a response, but it comes back to my previous comments about the escalation. Is they're limited in what the response will be. Like, what do you fire a few more drones into Ukraine? Do you fire a few more missiles? Do you fire the Oreshnik at a few targets in Ukraine? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
do believe there's a response coming, but it'll take that form. It'll just be a larger version of what the Russians have basically been doing before in pretty much every day. It'll just be a larger drone strike, a larger missile strike. Where I'm a little bit puzzled is by the seemingly drones. I can sort of understand, because a drone is a drone. It's cheap. You're using it to basically the bog down Ukrainian air defense, so missiles and stuff can get through. But in terms of like, this is where I was coming back to the point with the Tu-95s and the X-100s and ones that they fire, is they don't. Maybe it's because the Ukrainians are very good at covering up the targets that might be being hit, but in general, it doesn't seem that the Russians are particularly hitting targets that are of major importance on a fairly regular basis. It seems to be very piecemeal targeting that the Russians are going by. Occasionally, you do see things like Iskandars are an exception to that. The more expensive stuff, the Iskandars, from my understanding and from what I've seen, always tend to be targeted at an ongoing target of opportunity, a gathering of Ukrainian officers, a Ukrainian basing area where there's like Ukrainians are transiting some kind of military equipment, something like that. So maybe they could widen the target availability for the Iskandars, or maybe even the Oreshniks. But this would come back to an argument that I made earlier this month, where the Ukrainians are constantly escalating this stuff. They're carrying out pretty brazen assassinations, not just in Russia, in Spain now. Granted, the guy who was assassinated was actually a Ukrainian national, but I think it's pretty obvious it was the Ukrainians behind him. But, they start carrying out assassinations in Spain. They've
Mm-hmm.
assassinated Russian senior officers. They've assassinated Ukrainian defectors and stuff. I would kind of question at what stage, because there is kind of this understanding in international geopolitics that you don't start killing the politicians of the adversarial country. You don't start killing the heads of state, because that's just going to open up a can of worms that is not going to end well for anyone.
Yeah, but don't the US, when they go somewhere like Iraq and all that, always try to decapitate?
Well, that's third world countries are different.
Okay.
Let's be honest. Like if you kill a bunch of Iraqi politicians or something, the Iraqis don't really have a way to respond to it. This is kind of like you don't kill the head of the Communist Party for Shanghai in a CIA operation. You don't kill the MI6 doesn't murder the head of a Russian oblast. The Russian FSB doesn't decide to start killing a Russian parliamentarian. U.S. congressmen don't get assassinated by like agents of the Venezuelan state, countries with capability, because there's, once you open that can of worms, what's like if we're going to start killing Russian politicians, what's to stop the FSB from setting off car bombs in the center of Washington, or what's to stop, MI6 starts popping Chinese Communist Party officials, what's to stop the Chinese from like setting off fucking SARS bombs in the middle of London? Do you know what I mean? It's that's kind of worms you don't really open. But in terms of Ukraine is kind of pushing at that door and has been for quite a while. So where I'm kind of a little bit nonplussed is why the Russians not necessarily responding kind in kind, assassinating Zelensky, killing Ukrainian politicians. But I'd imagine that if the Ukrainians, as they have done, are killing Russian generals and senior flight officers for the Russian Air Force who are involved in bomber squadrons and stuff inside Russia in assassinations, why don't the Russians kind of start doing the same to the Ukrainians? Is it a lack of capability? Is it a restraint for some kind the Russians are holding themselves to? Because this is one of the things that have kind of confused me for a couple of years now, actually, is the Ukrainians are doing all this kind of stuff in Russia, assassinations, bombings, blowing up bridges, hitting air bases. And we very rarely see any, if any, of that from the Russians inside Ukraine. But we know that the Russians have these assets inside Ukraine. They must have, there is a substantial pro-Russian population.
I heard that in the west part of Ukraine, there's local Ukraine partisans, blowing up train railways and things like that.
But to what extent? Because that's the kind of stuff that would make it into the news. Like you do see little tint bits of it, like a local conscription officer is killed. His car gets blown up.
Maybe they're not reporting the train disruptions and things like that.
But are they, again, where I only think that Ukrainian state media can cover up this stuff like we do see and hear the news of, the local conscription officer for Nikolaev is being assassinated because a woman suicide bombed his office, or local conscription officers up in Vinnytsia have been assassinated by unknown assailants. Or like there's been a car bombing in Lvov or stuff like that. It's fairly low level stuff, and it's relatively rare when it happens, but you do hear about it. So, but is this Russians? Is this pissed off Ukrainians? But we know like the Russians have some serious assets in Ukraine, because last year sometime there was a SVR officer who was arrested in Odessa, sitting on effectively like a massive cache of weapons, and apparently his job was had the Russian army done better in the initial invasion and approached Odessa Oblast, he was effectively to try and instigate like a local coup or uprising of the pro-Russian element in the city. Obviously, that didn't happen, so he just kind of went underground and went off comms. But, if that was being done in Odessa, I would imagine there must be Russian assets elsewhere across Ukraine, but we don't really seem to be, if they are operating, they don't seem to be operating anywhere near the level of what the Ukrainians are doing inside Russia itself, which I find a little curious. I'm interested in why. Is it a restraint on the Russian part? Is it just a lack of capability on their part? So that's kind of my retort. Like, if the Ukrainians are going to start waging like this black war inside Russia, why doesn't Russia do the same?
Are these sabotage acts a sign of Ukraine's running out of battlefield options, or a bold new front in the war?
A bit of both. That's kind of how I view it. A bit of both.
Okay.
This the war at the front again is completely different to this unseen war as such that's being waged. The war at the front isn't going well for Ukraine. The Russians have kind of actually stopped doing it, and people are taking it as a sign of bias. But I think it's just kind of self-evident at this side. How many times a day do people need me to tell them day after day that the Russians have taken a new village in Zaporizhia Oblast or in Donetsk Oblast? Is the Russian front. Some parts go static, other parts start moving forward. In Sumy Oblast, the Russians are edging forward towards Sumy itself. So the war at the front isn't going well for Ukraine. It's, I don't want to say bleak. It's better than it was this time last year, but it's not going well. The Russians are constantly on the advance. They're constantly taking new territory, constantly pushing the Ukrainians back here, there, and everywhere. The collapse of Kursk. So the conventional war is not going well. So I do believe the Ukrainians have been doing these black operations inside and against Russia pretty much since the earliest days of the war. So this isn't something that they've just suddenly sprung up. And by all accounts, this Operation Spider's Web has been going on for a year and a half. But I do believe that they're escalating it, one, because the situation at the front is deteriorating. But also another aspect is you do have these ongoing talks in Istanbul. So I'd imagine it's trying to put more pressure on Russia for these talks. So like either you start presenting realistic demands, or maybe we're going to do another air base attack, or maybe we're going to hit another crucial part of Russian military infrastructure or assets. So I'd view that as one aspect of it, is just trying to turn up the pain to make the Russians be, in the Ukrainian eyes, be more accommodatable to in negotiations. And also another aspect I'd imagine is probably signaling to quote unquote Western partners that, look, we are still in this fight. This thing isn't over and done with. We still have teeth and options left to play. So stand by us. I'd imagine this is probably a lot more to the Americans than the Europeans, but this kind of idea, like, we can still fight, we can still do damage, we are still in this game, continue to support us, don't back out on us, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then there's the Crimea Bridge, or Kerch Bridge. Hang on, this one. A 19-kilometre artery linking mainland Russia with Crimea. On October 8th, 2022, a truck bomb caused significant damage, killing 4 and disrupting traffic for weeks. More recently, reports of underwater drone attacks potentially launched from Ukrainian naval assets have targeted the bridge supports. Ukrainian officials have openly celebrated these strikes, calling the bridge a legitimate target. Russia, which views Crimea as an integral part of its territory since 2014, sees these attacks as assaults on its national integrity. So, Michael, the June 3rd, 2025 underwater attack on the Crimea Bridge, how does it compare to the one in 2022 and 2023?
Well, the one in 2023, obviously, it collapsed the span of the bridge completely. This is the kind of stuff, particularly the one that happened the other day. This is the kind of stuff where I believe that, like, particularly the British and probably the French are intimately involved in this kind of stuff, because it was the underwater drone technology and stuff. It's largely not pioneered, but in terms of Ukraine, it's the British that are providing a lot of it to the Ukrainians, or the know-how and knowledge of it. So what I think the recent attacks are probably more performative than substantive. I don't really see where the damage was done. They hit some of the spans, but the amount of explosives that seemed to have been used wasn't anywhere near enough to cause the significant damage to the span as like the truck bomb did. And for people who are not aware, another horrendous aspect of the truck bombing, alongside collapsing the road span of the bridge, also took out the rail element next to the bridge out. But also some of those were killed were a Russian family who were very tragically and unfortunately passing by the truck in their car at the time that it went off. So that was kind of an example. Again, I hesitate to use the word successful because of this poor family that were effectively murdered in the attack. But it did take out the bridge for months. This just seems, I think this is probably a bit more performative. Like I say, I think this is all part of a wider campaign that the Ukrainians are waging at the moment, a very high profile campaign to try and get eyes back on the conflict. You hit the air base, you hit the bridges one day, you hit the air bases the next, you hit the bridge the next couple of days later, because the bridge is such a high profile target and everyone's talking about it. However, in terms of like logistics, I don't think the bridge is as important as it once was. So I think the strategic onus to hit or destroy the bridge has lost its luster for the Ukrainians, hence why there hasn't been attacks on it for some time. And these recent attacks didn't really seem to have a lot of thrust to them. This is because the Russians have repaired and set up new logistical routes through Donetsk, Zaporizhia, into Kherson and down into Crimea. So yeah, it'd be painful if they did take out the bridge, and it'd be a big, exciting notch on Ukraine's belt. But in terms of like the strategic onus is the right word. I'm trying to think of the correct word, but the strategic need to immediately take out the bridge there and now, don't think it's quite there is where it once was. So I think this is more of a theatrical and performative attack on the bridge than substantive.
Russia says the bridge is heavily defended. How did Ukraine's underwater explosives slip through the naval patrols and sensors this time?
Again, well, that's kind of the question. Unfortunately, this bridge attack actually happened while I've been working a lot, so I've only been able to glance at it. But I haven't seen the Russians say necessarily how they got through the nets or the security elements of it. But these were underwater drones, from my understanding. So maybe the Ukrainians have managed to set one of these drones up with like a pair of shears to cut through the nets, which allowed them through. Or maybe one of the drones, because from my understanding is was it a succession of drones or just the one drone?
Just one with 1,100 kilos of TNT.
Just one. Okay. Maybe there is a smaller drone that might have detonated at the bridge to allow it through, or who knows? Maybe it could have been dropped into the area. I'm not saying by air, but maybe on one side of the shore, on one side of the bridge, out inside the netted zone, maybe someone could have come up with a pickup, because obviously now we know that Ukrainians are openly operating inside Russia. Maybe they managed to smuggle one in and slip it into the waters that way. But I'm going to admit, unfortunately, I haven't been able to keep fully abreast in this attack, just paying attention too much to the airbase attacks and working so much recent days.
Just grabbing the video. There's the video there of it going off.
Yeah. So a big explosion, but whenever it comes up against stuff in concrete like that, it's it's the kind of thing you'd either have to put repeated or underneath the how to explain it. This is me trying to use which I'm not an expert in, engineering knowledge. It's like, if you just blow up like a grenade against a brick wall, it's not going to do much than superficial damage against the grenade. But say if like you remove one of the bricks and then you put the grenade inside where that brick was and then set it off, that's going to do a lot more damage to the wall. So this is where I think it's probably a bit more performative. Yeah, it was a big explosion, probably some level of damage to the bridge itself, probably more from the vibrations of the explosion than the explosion itself. But unless you can sort of like slip the explosions into like a space where it's going to condense the explosion a lot more than just out where it can be dispersed out into open air and open water, you're not really going to do much more to the bridge. This is why I think the initial attack on the bridge back in 2023, was it the truck bombing or was it 2022? 22. That's why they went after the road. They tried to collapse the span as opposed to collapse the span by physically destroying the road, as opposed to trying to collapse the bridge itself.
What's the evidence for UK involvement given their fixation on Crimea and Storm Shadow missile supplies?
Again, I haven't been able to pay close attention to it, but from my estimation, it's just sort of like a general understanding that the British have been particularly involved in the Ukrainian naval aspect of the war, and in terms of drones. So this is one area where I can certainly believe that the British, the French, NATO states would have probably had a far more intimate hand and involvement in. Probably not the direct direction of the operation itself, but certainly in an advisory and supplying of the technology capacity.
Let's get on to Russia's potential responses. With airfields, railways, and Crimea Bridge hit, what's Russia's most likely first response to restore deterrence?
I don't really think they have much of a deterrence or a capacity to restore it, because how do you deter Ukraine from doing this kind of stuff? Well, you can't really, because if you could have done it, they would have done it by now. Probably
Okay, so should Russia unleash the Oreshnik missile on Ukrainian targets like the SBU headquarters? And what
uh,
message would that send?
if I was on, again, going back to my spiel about Ukrainian black operations inside Ukraine, inside Russia, and assassinations and stuff, I would start to posit the idea, again, with the caveat, if you start doing this to the Ukrainians, are the Ukrainians suddenly going to start trying to assassinate people like Shoigu and senior Russian figures?
Well,
But
didn't they try Putin the other day in a helicopter with drones?
I'm skeptical if it was an actual assassination attempt on Putin per se, as what they are claiming. I wouldn't be surprised if the helicopter happened to be in the area while there was a drone there, and the drone operator happened to see the helicopter and thought, "Screw it." Otherwise, then it'd be pretty concerning to Russians, at least, or at least Putin, if this was an assassination attempt on him. How did the Ukrainians know he was in the area, what helicopter is in, and all those aspects?
From the US.
Well, again, then you come back to the idea the Ukrainians just incapable of acting on their own, but are the US really out to assassinate Vladimir Putin whenever Trump is rather fond of him for whatever reason? And then, if the Ukrainians do assassinate Vladimir Putin, it's a can of worms that once you open it, probably going to come back and hit you pretty very substantially hard in the face, particularly given that there have been at least 3 incidents that I know where the Russians knew exactly where Zelensky was, and they could have killed him fairly easily, that they were specifically ordered not to. The big example being when, after they retook Kherson, Zelensky did that rally in that central square in Kherson City, and Russian drones were flying overhead, and they all knew that he was there. But the local artillery regiments on the other side of the river were told specifically, "Do not fire. If you fire, we're basically going to execute you," kind of thing. So, it's pretty demonstrable that the Russians have a level of restraint. Don't start killing senior Ukrainian officials. But I would start saying, if I was sitting if I was advising the Russian military, if Vladimir Putin, if Vladimir Vladimirovich is in my Telegram channel, as some people seem to,
He might be watching this show. Go
he
ahead.
might be watching this show. I would start saying, if this is what Ukraine's going to start doing inside Russia, maybe it wouldn't be such a drastic option to maybe hit the SBU headquarters with an Oreshnik. Maybe it wouldn't be such a good idea. It wouldn't be such a bad idea to start thinking a bit more competently about your target allocation, about your missiles. If the Oreshnik has the capabilities that it is purported to have, which it is claimed to have, I would start saying, well, maybe we should start lining up about 30 of these. maybe it's time to collapse every single bridge that we can across the Dnieper. If the Ukrainians are going to start blowing up our bridges in Bryansk and Kursk. And this is something I'm kind of curious why the Russians have never really made an attempt, apart from one occasion, to do it, is cut off East Bank Ukraine from West Bank Ukraine via that aspect. Maybe start hitting, See, the thing is, it's like the Ukrainian, you had that drone attack on the Kremlin. It didn't really come to much, but they blew up the flag on top of the Grand Kremlin Palace, if you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
So, there is precedent here. The Ukrainians have allegedly done it before. So is it really going to be out of turn for the Russians to do it? But I'd say, maybe, like I say, the SBU headquarters, why is that building still standing? Is it because they're kind of afraid if we hit that with an Iskandar, that the Ukrainians are going to bomb the Lubyanka or something? But, the Ukrainians are constantly pushing out this door. It always constantly escalating just a little on their aspect. So it's just like, well, I don't want to use the term the gloves off, because the Russians, this war is pretty much gloves off. But in terms of like strategic strikes and special operations and stuff, I do feel like the Russians are. Is it incompetence? Is it a level of restraint? Is it just an unwillingness to do it? I do feel like the Russians are very passive in this theater of the war.
So is Russia's cyber and sabotage capability strong enough to hit Ukraine's infrastructure as hard as it's been hit?
I would say yes. And I would like, as people who are a regular viewer and subscriber to my content will know, like, I'm very big on Russian corruption and Russian incompetence, but that only goes so far. Surely I'm of the mindset that the Russians do have this capability. They have demonstrated, you've always got Russian cyber attacks going here, on there, everywhere. At the start of the war, they took down pretty much a lot of Ukrainian telecommunications. So they have this capability. Like I say, we have evidence that there are Russian deep assets across Ukraine who are heavily armed. So I'm just kind of curious as to why they aren't being employed. And if they're not being employed, surely now, if the Ukrainians have just kind of, I don't want to say openly declared this war, because they've declared it long ago and been waging it, but the Russians always just seem to be rather passive in response to it. Is it like a strategic decision in Moscow where it's just like, no, look, we'll just let them do what they will, just suffer the consequences. Everything is focused at the front, and the front is what matters ultimately. I don't know. It's a very, very curious aspect of the war for me, but I do believe, like, if the Russians wanted to, they could probably do a lot more damage inside Ukraine with their assets in Ukraine, or in terms of their missile strikes. But for whatever reason, is they don't. And is it because they don't want to, or is it because they can't? I think I err towards they don't want to for some reason, as opposed to they can't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of my spiel on that. Loathed for me to advocate escalation, but if Russia is going to up the ante or escalate it, even with its hands tied in many respects, if they're hitting your strategic bombers, when, now, if not never.
Mm-hmm. How effective would intensive missile strikes on Ukrainian cities be in stopping these deep strike operations?
Not very, because the Russians have been doing that for years, and it doesn't really seem to achieve much. Okay. Again, I think it's largely down to a targeting issue. I'd like to, again, obviously Moscow's not going to put this out publicly, but I'd be very interested to see just how target allocation is done for drones and missiles for the Russians. Because, like I say, the Iskandars always seem to be targeted at a target of opportunity, something towards the war effort. But the drones just seem to be fired off in a haphazard fashion. Again, mostly because they are there to soak up air defense. But the ones that do get through always seem to hit like an apartment complex or a random street. The other Russian cruise missiles, again, very curious as to what the target allocation is for those, because the amount of stuff that gets fired into Ukraine, granted, lots of it gets shot down, but in terms of the damage or the outcome from the strikes, to me, seem to be very low par for the assets that are deployed. So, yeah, not that Russia owes me anything, let alone their top secret military secrets and how they do target allocation, but I'd be very interested to see just how these targets are allocated. Because I'm just of the mindset, I'm pretty sure that they could be done in a far more effective manner.
Maybe in 10 years there'll be a book out and you can read that.
Yeah, a book I'll be very fascinated to read, and I'll be looking through it and I'll be thinking, oh, look, they took my idea that I posted in the channel.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably, but
What's your take? Oh, sorry, go on.
I'm just of the mindset. I do think that in terms of like irregular warfare, special operations, the drone and missile strikes, I do think that the Russians could probably be getting a lot more outcome for their commitment. That's kind of where my mindset is on it. And again, for reasons that are unknown to me at this stage, they don't seem to be achieving that.
What's your take on Russia striking Western targets like NATO hubs in Poland if US or UK involvement is confirmed?
It will never happen.
Okay.
I just generally, this comes up again and again over the years. Russia is nowhere near in a state to commit to a war with NATO. It's just not on the cards. And in the same way that NATO isn't, yeah, they'll make it hurt for the Russians in Ukraine, but you're not going to have the Polish tank division cross the border into Belarus. For various reasons. Russia is just not in a state to go in this go for conflict with NATO, let alone start striking targets within NATO territory, which is what would provoke that conflict. So,
but could a limited strike on a Western asset like a UK training camp deter NATO without sparking a full war?
do you mean as in the Russians land a missile on
Yeah.
inside Britain?
Inside Western Europe somewhere, where a training camp.
No, that's the kind of thing that I don't think that's the kind of thing you could do and get away from. That's anything that a strike like that, an actual intentional military strike that results in deaths and damage. That's the kind of thing that you just can't come back from, and I don't think the Russians would ever broach the idea of doing it, because it's just the ramifications of it are something I don't think Moscow. I think they're fully aware of the ramifications of it, but I don't think it's something that they are anywhere near the level of broaching or handling if it came to it. This will just stay as this kind of proxy war, largely limited to Ukraine. I don't think you're going to see the Russians striking targets in Poland or anything like that. And even if the other aspect on that is, even if they wanted to, I'd say that the Russians, again, this comes back to the previous aspect. I've had people talking about this stuff for years. If the Russians could intercept all this equipment that comes from Poland, well, why haven't they yet in Ukraine?
Why haven't they shut down the rail system from Poland into Lvov?
Yeah, like that would be, again, that's probably another good idea for the Oreshnik if it has the capabilities it has. Any train bridges across that on that rail line, don't hit it in Poland. Obviously, probably give a good 20-mile buffer zone on the Ukrainian side of the border from any Western borders, but then just like start hitting bridges, rail bridges, stuff like that. Maybe in terms, you can't really destroy roads, but if you hit road bridges, you'd probably more performative action than a substantive action. But I can remember back near the start of the war, the Russians tried to hit some tunnel, the rail tunnel that came from Slovakia. Didn't really amount to much, but this is the kind of stuff that Russia just doesn't seem to either it can't, but can it really not? It just seems to be that Russia just doesn't want to, for whatever reason, to commit to this kind of stuff. For whatever reason.
So how close are we to Russia considering a nuclear option, given its doctrine and the triad's targeting?
Not very close at all, for the reasons I've kind of given throughout the hour. If they hit the subs, if they tried to go after the land, deterrent and stuff all at the same time, maybe that would be something that could spook Moscow that way. But I mean, like, what, you know, this is kind of the big question it keeps asking. Well, is Russia going to nuke something? Well, what would Russia nuke? And what would be the utility of Russia nuking it? Like, is Russia going to nuke Washington because of this? Doubt it, because that's just self-destruction. Is Russia going to nuke Kiev? Well, what would be gained by that? You become an international pariah state far beyond anything North Korea. That's, you know, once you start opening the nuclear door, I'm pretty sure that's whenever the Chinese are going to start saying, no, this is far beyond us. This is kind of whenever anyone who's a friend of Moscow is probably just going to start saying, yeah, this is getting too hot for us. This is not something we're going to be associated with. If you're going to start firing nukes about, and even then, one thing about firing nukes about, what would you even hit with the nukes? What would be the outcome from it? Okay, so you turn half of Ukraine into a radioactive desert. Well, winds blow and all that radioactivity is going to blow up into Belarus and into Russia. And it's like, well, great, you've irradiated half of European Russia for what?
Yeah.
So, you know, it catches headlines and stuff because it's nuclear weapons, but I don't think there's just no realistic or viable route for a nuclear confrontation or deployment during this conflict that I can see of.
So what's the domestic pressure on Putin to act decisively, and how that might shape his response, like a Oreshnik deployment?
I don't really think Putin's very much dictated by domestic opinion, if I'm going to be honest.
What about from his hardliners in the government?
Yeah, that's where I think it'd be more likely to come from the higher echelons of the Siloviki and stuff like that, from the Security Council. The fact that we haven't seen it yet, although there was some strikes the other day, who knows? Maybe they're going to surprise me. Maybe they're listening to this and I've preempted them. Maybe the reason we haven't seen a strike yet, maybe it's because they're sitting down in the bunker or in the Security Council and figuring out, how can we make this work? How can we use these missiles and stuff to a painful enough extent to dissuade the Ukrainians from this kind of stuff? Maybe because generally you can sort of tell when something hurts the Russians. If the Ukrainians do something inside Russia, or they carry out something and that night there's more drones, more missiles come into Russia, that's kind of like the knee jerk. The Russians, okay, well, we pissed off the Russians, but whenever you hurt the Russians, it's whenever you go, okay, they've not responded for a few days now. It's because they're thinking of what they're going to do, how to do it, and how to do it effectively. That's whenever I think it's kind of like, from my personal experience, from my viewing of the conflict, is whenever there's a big event, Ukrainians do, and it's whenever you have this ominous, I don't want to say silence, because there are drone and missile strikes that go on, but you have this ominous lapse between the Ukrainian action and then the Russian response. It's kind of whenever you say, well, that's something that's hurt Russia, and the Russians are going to make sure whatever they do in response hurts in return.
Could Russia use these attacks to rally global South support, framing the West as the aggressor via Ukraine?
Maybe with the Chinese, again, because of how close the Belenia Air Base is to, well, it's not relatively close to China because you've got Mongolia then China, but, you know, farthest Siberia. They could probably posit that way, that, like, this is the Ukrainians, the lapdogs of Western NATO, hitting targets basically out in your sphere of the continent. Maybe we should start thinking of strategies and stuff like that to negate any potential aspect like this in the future. But in terms, like, if there's countries out in the world, I think they've already kind of, I don't think anyone's going to be persuaded one way or the other by this kind of stuff, because if I think everyone's picked their side already. Russia has its cabal of aligned states in Africa. You have BRICS plugging along. I think everyone's kind of in their camp already.
Okay. And that, my friends, brings us to the close of live show 138, the Oreshnik Cometh from Minsk, Belarus. We've peeled back the layers of the conflict that grows heavy with each passing day. Ukraine strikes on Russia's nuclear bombers, the sabotage of vital railway bridges, the audacious attacks on the Crimea Bridge, and the looming shadow of Russia's response. And with Michael from Buhanka Watch and your incredible insights in the chat, we've wrestled with the hard questions. Who stands behind these acts? What role do Western powers play? And what might the Oreshnik, the harbinger of Russia's resolve, mean for Ukraine and the world? The truth is, we stand at the crossroads. The wreckage of bridges, the scars on the airfields, and the trembling pillars of the Crimea are not just battlegrounds. There are warnings. A world pushed to the brink does not allow a step back. Yet, in this moment, your voices, your questions, and your demand for clarity light the way forward. So, Michael, again, how can everybody get hold of you?
Oh, again, just look up Bohanka Watch for Michael Delabrock. It should hopefully take you to my X account or my Telegram account. So my Telegram is t.me / Mike Delta Echo Lima Alpha Bravo Romeo Oscar Charlie. That's
I'll put all those in the description after the show as well.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much. So
yes, and when do we going to see you again in Minsk?
I'm thinking August or September is whenever I'm looking at next coming out.
Okay.
So
everybody, thank you for joining us, for sharing your thoughts, and for being part of this urgent conversation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, catch the replay on Rumble, X, and YouTube. Subscribe to us to share this episode to spark more discussion, and hit the thumbs up to keep in touch and the truth alive. We're back next time, diving deeper, questioning harder, and searching for answers in a world that needs them now more than ever. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, keep the fire burning. From Minsk, this is the Oreshnik Cometh. Good night and take care.